I want to begin this video with two quotes. One by the late, great B.P. Nicol. Small press is the guardian of literary culture and free speech. This might be true. Here's a quote by Lawrence Ferlinghetti that I feel is definitely true. The avant-garde is not inherently leftist. We'll see the overlap of this later in the video, but B.P. Nicol, let's go in on BP here. He's kind of like the Velvet Underground is, where if you're like goth or ambient or into shoegaze, or you make art pop or rock and roll or indie or alternative, you're like, yeah, Velvet Underground really gets it, you know? And B.B. Nicol is the same way for poetry in Canada. If you're into lyric or visual poetry or conceptual poetry, concrete, experimental, Canadian avant-garde, Vanguardism, the topic of this video, then you're like, yeah, B.P. Nicol is the guy. And he really championed this concept of concrete poetry, which we'll zoom in on here as well. Concrete poetry is poetry in which the meaning or effect is conveyed partly or wholly by visual means, using patterns or of words or letters and other typographical devices. And concrete poetry is a really funny name for this, because it's entirely fluid, you know what I mean? Concrete poetry was like the hot shit in Canada during Nicol's lifetime, making it a bona fide Vanguardist tradition in the contemporary Canadian small press scene. And that's the main question of this video, is about Vanguardist Canadian small journals. And the issue here is that Vanguardist poetic traditions fall into gatekeepy masculinist traditions, which is so weird because the idea is to break the systems of control. Look at Warhol, Duchamp, Damien Hirst. What do they all have in common? Art bros. You know, is a small press publishing free from art bros? Absolutely not. I know it's a loaded question. But I guess the question of this video is Vanguardism inherently leftist, or has it, like the avant-garde, fallen into egoism? So let's back up here. What is Vanguardism? Here's a quote from the Britannica Encyclopedia. In the context of the theory of Marxist revolutionary struggle, Vanguardism is a strategy whereby the most class-conscious and politically advanced sections of the proletariat or working class, described as the revolutionary vanguard, form organizations in order to draw larger sections of the working class towards revolutionary politics and serve as manifestations of proletariat political power against its class enemies. So, you know, it's like there's going to be a small contingency of people that advocate for the larger contingency of people. This is the way things work. That's why we got the internet and books and, Larry King, or whatever. But how did we get here from the literary scene? How did we get from communism to, Canadian small presses? Well, the answer is actually kind of interesting. The term, in literary sense, comes from Latin American literature. The word was vanguardia for their avant-garde. They wanted shockingly novel forms, and we see this in the work of Octavio Paz, Pablo Neruda, but even more notably here, the works of Leonora de Barros, Mirtha Dermiache, and Clarice Lispector. You can't talk about 20th century Latin American writing without bringing up the GOAT, Clarice Lispector. So, Canada has several presses that have a ton of clout in art publishing. Talon Books, Coach House, Sononise. They've moved on to more traditional publishing as of late. This is an issue I ran into here. But to find the new horizons, I attended the Meet the Presses Indie Lit Symposium and their panel, Outlaw Presses, Pushing the Boundaries of the Small Press. So I did a bit of research, and I got some quotes for you here from this panel. First up was Brian Dodora, who's the founder and editor of Noir Z. And when asked what the most boundary-pushing aspect of his journal was, he stated that his edition numbers were non-sequential. So it wasn't edition 1, edition 2, it was edition 17, 24, 9. And that makes it, it's inherently anarchic because it makes it hard to archive. He says he's fighting against blandness and prize culture. He doesn't want the Academy to reflect on his book, to reflect on his work at all. Danny Spinoza is a poet that I interviewed recently. She's the author of Anarchists in the Academy. And here's a clip from when I asked her why she titled her book the way she did. So, the title of the book, I have a list of things that I think it could be, and you can tell me if they're right. It's very similar to the first question I asked you. Okay, so we came up with eyeballs, maybe, two people's blood type, 00. 007, maybe, James Bond. Two halves of infinity sign, boobs, headlights, or a Venn diagram with nothing in common with itself. Those are the options. Those are the things we came up with. It could also be two O's. But I was curious. I'm like, what the fuck is
that? Great question. You know what? People always ask me, how do you pronounce it? And no one's ever asked, what does that mean? I have dreaded this moment. Because the truth, well, maybe this is perfect. Maybe this fits in exactly with what we've been talking about. What I really wanted to do was call it OO. And then the 70s typewriter avant-garde especially loved putting periods in the O's to make them look like eyes, which incidentally was your first guess. And I was like, we're doing this. That's the title of my book. And it's a thing that you won't ever be able to put in the catalog. So
Sure.
The catalog name will be OO and the ISBN will be for OO, but that's not the name. The name will be these two eyes looking, because I'm saying, look, don't make it make meaning. Just look at them.
There seems to be a anti-Academy metric here. There are ways that these poets are undermining our systems of objectivity and our existing systems of capitalism. So this seems like a point for outlaw or vanguard poetry. Now, back to the symposium. Sasha Archer of Simulacrum Press said this in attendance. Simulacrum started with a vision I had of outsider work. I wanted to publish work that wasn't thought of as poetry. But every time I reached out, I failed. I shifted my ephemeral vision into something more concrete. We see this trend again of fluidity into concreteness. You can begin with vanguardist intentions and maintain that title while shifting towards marketability. The position of vanguard requires the fluidity of the art we are making. Once upon a time, the sonnet was experimental, and now we have to accept that the postmodern ideas of art we have are now mainstream. Here's another angle on why some became a poetry outlaw or vanguard. J.W. Curry is the founder of Room 302. He came clean at the symposium, stating that he started it to sell his own books, saying, after 11 or 12 editions, I realized publishing my own stuff was just wrong. And I don't see anything wrong with self-publishing. In fact, I think it might be the solution to a lot of the problems we're discussing here today. But to assign yourself the title of outlaw while selling your own books does slip into the egoism of the avant-garde that was discussed earlier in the video. Derek Beaulieu also publishes his own work, but he releases it all online for free. He said, "Your work becomes bigger than yourself. How do I interact with human beings? You have to care about people other than yourself. It's less of a sense that if I fuck it up, it's just me, but when you're publishing someone else, that's not the case." So the assumption of the small press is that you need someone else to publish your work. It's exclusive. But when you give someone else your work to publish, you're saying, publish this how you would. And that has a lot of value. But ultimately, if you're trying to be an outlaw or a vanguard or create outsider work, to then turn to a established press says something about the way you feel, and says something about the way you feel about your work. And how do we get from someone like Lenora de Barros to Derek Beaulieu? And I'll answer that with my last quote from the symposium by Amanda Earle of Angel House Press. And she notes that each person and poet on the panel, other than her, was a man, and including her, they were all white. So that might speak to the nature of Vanguardism itself. Of course, Vanguardism took off in a country like Canada, which has a very homogenous population, other than the First Peoples, which, thanks Trudeau for all the work you've done with that. Many people consider themselves to be in the minority group of poet, but that maintains the power structures that come from non-poetic culture. An issue that the publishing world falls into often is replicating the culture we attempt to be deviant from. If the presidents of poetry are still old white men, then how are they any different than our actual presidents? A poetry of demilitarization, anarchy, and revolutionary vanguardism has quite a few strings attached. I spoke to author Danny Spinoza about this recently. Here's the clip. So you're already in this underserved demographic of visual poets, and then also you do this thing called being a woman. It's tricky, so I guess how do you get excited about where you're publishing when your list is so narrow? It's well, these are the places that respect who I am as a person, and then these are the places that publish the kind of thing that I like, and then just sometimes there's this that Venn diagram is two circles. So how do you get excited about that?
I am happy to give you the best answer to this question, which is you make it your fucking self. Sure. We just made it. We made it. We were where do we go? There's nowhere that we go.
A place called Gap Riot Press, maybe.
A place called Gap Riot, and we riot in the Gap. Hello.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I know some of those dudes are the best dudes. For sure, I love some of those guys. Some of them get on my nerves a little bit. Most of them are Rob McLennan is the best guy. He is so wonderful. You can quote me on that a million times. It's not that he fucking is doing great things for representation. So the issue was just the resources weren't there. The mentorship wasn't there. And we had to start freaking doing it. And I don't have time. We don't have time. Kate's working full time at a adult human job. I'm trying to scrap together a living doing contract teaching. And it is the most freaking rewarding thing I've ever done with my life. I always say, if gun to my head, I had to pick between Gap Riot and publishing my own poetry, I'd never publish another poem. I'd just do Gap Riot for the rest of my life. I love it. It's the best. And also everybody should make a press, and we should have as many presses as there are poems, and just go. It's the best.
There should be a press for every poem. The natural conclusion to this is that small presses are still too big. I could sing to you about why you need to self-publish 50 broadsides with handwritten numbers and hand them out for free like those card slappers in Las Vegas. But just as the presses are too big to affect real systemic changes, so too is the stigma around self-publishing. Setting up your own press should be expected. My advice would be to not assign yourself a tag like experimental, avant-garde, or, God forbid, vanguardist, because those titles come with a responsibility that seems unachievable. Just take it easy. Publish what you want, for who you want, and your readership of friends will do a lot more for political healing than getting a poem in the New Yorker. And I'm just saying that because my unattainable dream publication is in Fence. But anyways, thank you for your time, and thanks for watching.